quite as common a view is that nations are now increasingly capable of tipping the flat world in their favor through various forms of actual interventions in markets to create comparative advantage. To the extent this is true, however, we are going to have a new growth paradigm. And it's based on two sort of mega trends. The first one is the evolution of corporate strategy from the national corporation in the first few decades after World War II, where virtually all the company's assets were in the home country. In the 60s and 70s, the multinational corporation emerged, where marketing, production, and a little bit of R&D assets were allocated around the world. We now are in the transition to the truly global corporation. Because we're in the transition, it's a little bit hard to see or make the distinction between global and multinational. But basically, a global company distributes all assets wherever they are most productively used. I'm taking the words right out of the mouth of Sam Palmisano, the CEO of IBM. He said this on a number of occasions. Even in emerging economies like China, Lenovo, their PC company that bought the IBM PC business, they keep presenting themselves as a truly global company. They do not even have a headquarters. Their marketing operations for the entire world are in Bangalore, India. So this is happening. The bottom line of this is that these corporations have a reduced stake in the home country. In fact, when people say an American company, a European company, a Japanese company, my eyes begin to glaze over because it's becoming less and less meaningful. Clearly, this transition has a ways to go. It will take years, but it's happening. So then the question is, who is left that has a sole focus on the domestic economy and has the interests of economic growth in that economy as its core concern? Well, it happens to be government. So what we're seeing now is the emergence of governments as competitors. And if you look around the world at the increasingly varied forms of government support through technology clusters, various financial incentives, training, education programs, they are becoming increasingly active in providing a more and more elaborate innovation infrastructure for their domestic industry. And the objective is to attract global capital, not just domestic capital, into the domestic economy. So policy is going to have to recognize this. The economic tools we develop are going to have to be based on a much more complex view of the technology-based economy than my fellow neoclassical economists currently conceive it to be. So, what is the problem? Overall, the United States is a high-tech economy by conventional definitions, but it's no longer the high-tech economy. The world now conducts $1 trillion worth of R&D a year. We have slightly less than a third of that, but that share is declining. Another aspect of this problem is that this macro trend and all the various elements of it unfold. We look around us and we see resistance to doing the things that are required to adapt to this, this changing paradigm. And I attribute this resistance, in my book I call them the apostles of denial, which includes probably most of my fellow economists. How many times have you heard someone say recently that the American economy is sound, that trade is good for America? Well, they're unfortunately overly simplistic statements and do not really respond to the complexity of the technology-based economy as it's unfolding. The first reason for the resistance to change is what I call the installed base effect. For an economy like the U.S. to rise up to world leadership position, it required the investment and absorption of huge amounts of a variety of assets, not just technology, capital, human, organizational, marketing. And that sunk cost acts as a barrier to change, because having made that investment and having seen it work, it's human nature to be reluctant to deliberately obsolete it and go with a radically new paradigm. Related then to that installed base effect is the fact that people learn how to use these assets. And having successfully done so, and especially this is a problem for the leading country, which we have been, we believe that this paradigm will work forever. You've invested so much time in learning how to combine and use effectively the various assets to drive your business that it's very difficult to admit you may have to, again, change to a new paradigm. So one of my favorite sayings is that the long run is not a problem until you get there. Then it's a crisis, and by definition a crisis is difficult and time-consuming to change. So, how will we construct this new growth paradigm? First of all, we're going to have to revise the way we look at the law of comparative advantage. A couple weeks ago, one of the discussants in the session where ITIF presented its critique of the RAM report mentioned this law of comparative advantage. It's in all first-year economic textbooks. It was conceived by some English economists in the late 1700s. And basically what it says is that economic welfare can increase through trade. A fairly simplistic statement. And what it means mechanically is that countries will specialize in the assets in which they have a relative advantage. You don't even have to have an absolute advantage. If, for example, country A has a dominant technological position in a range of goods, it still pays for them to specialize in those goods in which it has a relatively greater, hence the term comparative advantage, and let other countries specialize in goods in which they have an absolute advantage but not as great. So that way efficiency is maximized. Now, the problem with this law is that while it worked for most of 2 centuries, in the sense that assets were relatively fixed in different countries, land for agriculture, mineral deposits, even when technology for manufacturing evolved through the 2 industrial revolutions, that took 2 centuries to complete. So adaptation was not a big issue. Shifting comparative advantage happened fairly rarely and slowly. So the adjustment process could take place. Even in the 20th century, when technology became more important, from the US perspective, we weren't so worried about the adjustment because when a new technology came along, which established a new comparative advantage, the new industry was US. It replaced an old industry, which was US. Now, I think we can all agree that this is going to be less and less the case going forward. So we're going to have to move away from this static view and oversimplified statement of the law of comparative advantage, which simply says, you, the U.S. economy, are going to produce these goods, these services, and we're not going to worry about change because the market can take care of it. That is no longer the case. Change is too rapid, and in fact, because of the large number of countries that are now capable of absorbing technology and using it effectively, we're basically chasing moving targets in terms of adapting. So that leads to the other concept that needs some updating. The famous Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter in the 1940s conceived of this process by which new technologies appear and move into the marketplace and take over markets from the old technology. The so-called principle of creative destruction. In Schumpeter's time, technology changed slowly. Today, we simply talk about creative destruction as new technology replacing old. Schumpeter was a lot more sophisticated, but the nuances in his characterization have been lost. For example, he noted that a new technology can appear, actually come into the marketplace, but remain latent in small niche markets for years. Only when a crisis arose, like the one we're in now, which changes the productivities of different assets, does the door open and the new technology moves in. Think back to the 1970s with the OPEC embargo and the consequent run-up in the price of petroleum, and then other commodities inflating rapidly, that obsoleted a large portion of the U.S. capital stock and opened the door for new technologies which moved in, assuming they were there and ready to go. So going forward, we're going to have to look at the transition to new technologies a lot more closely. I think the buzzword for policy over the next decade is going to be R&D efficiency. And that is a very broad definition. It also includes the distribution or diffusion of the knowledge that's produced by an R&D process. So, I mean, that's kind of a broad conceptual introduction. How do we actually develop policies based on these various economic principles we just discussed? Well, I propose a 5-step process, and in a sense, my book follows this outline. Whenever a technology-based growth policy exercise starts, the first thing that needs to be done is to demonstrate the importance of technology for economic growth. Now, I'm preaching to the choir here, so you're probably thinking, why? We all know that? Not exactly. Rapid technological change creates temporary structural unemployment. Members of Congress worry about that because it's their constituents. And as a result, they resist, or at least are worried about supporting technological change. And so maybe the optimal amount of resources is not allocated. I can remember in the Clinton administration, the Undersecretary for Technology, Mary Good, called me in one day and she said, I'm having a terrible time with Congress because they just don't think technology is good. They think it's going to unemploy their members, and I can't get anywhere. So she asked me to write a report summarizing what economists have learned about the impacts of technological change. She didn't know what that started, because 3 books later. Anyway, that should not be overlooked. If you pick up any report by, I don't care how prestigious an organization, they simply gloss over this. They say, it's important, they expect you to believe it, because they know, like we know, but the rest of the world does not. So, step 2, once you get by that and you're on somebody's radar screen, you then have to look for sort of bottom line, broad macro indicators of underperformance, because that's the only way you can justify policy change. So these 4 here are the ones that you commonly see discussed in terms of are they adequate or are they not. Then, though, to develop policy, you have to go down to the more microeconomic level. You have to look at individual industries, technologies, particular markets, and so your set of indicators changes to those that are associated with individual technologies and the industries that supply them. Then, and this is the intellectually most demanding step, is to understand the causes of underinvestment. Now remember, at the same time, we're assuming that government has a mandate to intervene when underinvestment is identified. That's not clear. I mean, I do battle all the time with my fellow economists over whether the government has a role or not. And if you look at certain government programs, including one at my agency, you can see the problems that still exist today with rationalizing a government role. So this is an absolutely essential step, because only then can you move to step 5, which is the design of the most efficient policy response. I mean, if I took a poll of people and I said, tell me when I should use a tax incentive or when I should use direct funding, I bet I wouldn't get a single answer. I haven't so far. So we need to really gear up here in terms of the economic principles that define, measure underinvestment, and then match that pattern with the right policy response. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through those 5 steps just to give you some examples. In terms of the importance of technology, instead of just saying it's important, I have about a 3 or 4 page annotated bibliography of 2 to 3 decades worth of economic research showing how technology affects the major bottom line indicators: output, sectors like manufacturing, trade, wages and salaries. This is something that it just boggles my mind that we don't mention. The BLS data that show that the wages, the median wages in high-tech industries exceed the average by 50% or more. This is lost on the broader policy community. We should be pounding the table with those kind of indicators. And then conversely, we need to emphasize that technology's stagnant sectors show slower productivity growth, inflation. Sometimes, like in the late 90s, technology can actually drive all the increase in productivity growth. And then a really bottom line indicator is that the majority of the growth in standard of living is due to productivity, which is in turn traced back to technology. And then for the corporate finance types, and because decisions on investment at the corporate level use these metrics, rates of return have been estimated for a number of years by economists here and in Europe, and on average they show the return to R&D is about 4 times after physical capital. So this fact confounds the neoclassical economists who just think more in global terms of capital, but you need to ask them what's inside the black box, okay? So, moving on to some performance indicators, I think this chart is particularly revealing. What I did here was I took the 9 recessions since World War II, not the one we're in now. And for the first 7, I plotted the average employment growth coming out of the trough of that recession. And you can see, that's the top line here, the blue one, that in about month 4 from the trough, employment began to accelerate. In other words, the recovery was quick and it was strong. But look what happened in 1990-91 recovery. It actually took 19 months before employment actually rose above the level at the trough of the recession. That's because in the 80s and leading into the 90s, there was beginning to be the offshoring. There was more investment in automation. But now look at 2001, 30 months. You can only imagine what the line is going to look like when we plot it 3-4 years from now for this recession, looking at the employment trends. It's not going to be a pretty picture. In converse, globalization has benefited businesses. They're able to allocate resources more efficiently. And the trend reflects the distribution away from labor towards corporations. The share of profits in GDP has turned around and has been increasing really since the 80s when offshoring began. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not criticizing it. I mean, that's what you want companies to do, be more efficient. But you want the value added to occur in your economy. And that's the major policy imperative that we're not addressing. And then, of course, we all know about trade. Look at this trend for all goods, and even the advanced technology portion, which is, according to the census, 500 product codes out of a total of 22,000. It ran surplus until 2002, and now it's an accumulating deficit. So even in the high-tech area, we're having problems in trade. Sir?
Could you expound just on that advanced technology products category? Because I think most people assume that might be cameras or cell phones or run-of-the-mill electronics, but no, that category is the cutting-edge future of nanotechnology, bioelectronics, the technology of the future. Is that correct?
Well, in theory, that should be the way, but I looked this up because every statistic I use, I try to look behind the number. The way the Census Bureau does this is purely qualitative. They make a judgment call on the technological content of the product in that particular category. And so it's their own definition. It's, as I say, totally qualitative. Across agencies, we have a lot of inconsistencies in how we define high-tech. In fact, there is no consistent definition of high-tech. I have one, but so what? I mean, okay. Another major indicator is R&D intensity. Now, this topic came up in the ITIF seminar critiquing the RAND study where someone questioned whether R&D intensity actually meant anything. Well, I think it means a lot as a macro overall indicator of an economy because, and I'm a real fan of ratios, it shows the share of a nation's output of goods and services that is being reinvested in technology as a way of competing in the future. Now, you can't make a lot of policy on a macro trend, but it sure shows you for your economy as a whole, you have something to worry about. Now, look at this trend. Ups and downs, but basically flat for 45 years. Now, think in that period of time, what has happened in terms of the emergence of other economies around the world that can compete with us on the basis of technology. We were once the most R&D intensive economy in the world back in this period of time. In fact, we've never exceeded the peak in the mid-60s in terms of R&D intensity. Right now, we're just a touch below it. And you can see by disaggregating that trend into the federal and industry funding trends, who the perpetrator of this problem is the federal government, the green line. Okay? This gets into, again, a whole set of economic issues. So how much federal spending, how much private spending, and economic theory, as I at least subscribe to it, would say that you need some public investment to facilitate private investment. It's a very general statement. There's a lot of detail into that. I'll show you a little bit of that in just a minute. But at some point, what is the optimum distribution? Look at this gap that's forming here. Something that needs to be studied. And in terms of international comparisons, R&D intensity it now puts us 8th in the world. I've been updating this for about 8 years. Every time I update it, the U.S. is a little farther to the right. In other words, to say we are the high-tech economy, no. So, and in fact, we're the only industrialized country I know of that does not have as a national objective increasing its R&D intensity. Something to think about. Another observation I want to make is what we call the high-tech sector, these 4 industry groups. It's a relatively small part of our economy. Unfortunately, BEA data is not disaggregated enough value-added data to accurately get a percentage of GDP that these 4 sectors or industry groups account for. But I've done a ballpark estimate, and I come out with about 7%. But just to be on the safe side, I put down 7 to 10%. So the point is, what does that say about the other 90% of the U.S. economy in terms of its ability to compete, to attain and maintain comparative advantage going forward? Now, as a follow-up to that, I was interested in looking at different sectors of the economy and how they performed, and I did this in terms of value-added growth. And I did this for 2 periods, 1985 to 2000, because in the mid-'80s was when global competition and offshoring really began to gear up. And then that carries through the dot-com boom to 2000. And then second, I wanted to look at how this decade shapes up in terms of the much more rapid offshoring of jobs and yet more broader globalization. So the color blue means that industry grew faster than the economy as a whole. Red means it grew less fast. So in the period from 1985 to 2000, the economy grew about 133%. Manufacturing grew slower, but still a respectable 93%. Traditional industry like motor vehicles, which does monster amounts of R&D, but clearly not enough when you look at how bad US-based companies are faring globally. But it grew 84%. But look at textiles, a measly 8%. And that's because offshoring began much earlier in this sector. Now here's a high-tech sector. in manufacturing. Computer and electronics, we created these industries, right? And during that 15-year period, value added produced by this group grew somewhat faster than GDP. Now we have 4 service industries, 3 of which are high-tech, healthcare, modestly technology intensive. But look at the growth rates here. Now, let's see how these rankings or performances may have changed in the current, or are changing in the current decade. GDP has grown 34%. Look at manufacturing. Dropped drastically to less than 9% growth rate. Motor vehicles, actually a negative growth. Value added has shrunk. Textiles, even more so, 35%. And even this high-tech sector has shrunk 25% in terms of value added. Now, you want to hazard a guess as to why this is happening? Looks like offshoring to me. And look at the R&D intensity. The remaining portion of this industry group in the U.S. economy, very R&D intensive, probably will do well. But can you grow an economy if too many of your industrial sectors are having this kind of performance? Obviously not. And then we go down to the 4 service industries. Somewhat of a surprise to me was to see the drop in growth of publishing. See, unfortunately, I can't get software value added separated from the broader publishing. But software is a dominant portion of this. You can tell that by the R&D intensity for that industry group. Look at this growth rate, less than the economy as a whole. Offshoring of software. And then we have the services, which are not highly tradable yet. They continue to perform well. So, one of my points here is to get you to see that you need to look at sectors. An economic growth strategy at the national level has to have this broader view. You can't run a big economy on one high-tech industry. We have to be diversified, which means we're going to have to take portfolio approaches to a greater extent than we're doing now in terms of how we distribute R&D funds. We've got to have a significant number of industry groups that are performing well, that have comparative advantages, and maintain them. I guess the last point I want to make about the R&D structure of the economy is its geographic concentration. 6 states account for half of R&D, and 10 states account for 60% of the total. And so the message is, what does that mean about the other 40 states in terms of their ability to be competitive and to generate those higher incomes that the BLS data show occur in high-tech industries? Now, you might say, well, those are just the high population states and we're just seeing that correlation, but that's not the case, because here are the top 10 states. They account for a little more than 60%, but 46.5% of the population. So there's a skewing. Now, the neoclassical economists say, well, the market will respond to price signals. Well, in high-tech industries, the price signals are often distorted for a number of reasons. Disaggregating industry funding into the 3 NSF categories, we can see that they have little use for basic research. In constant dollars, that's barely budged over this 15-year period. And that's because science is a highly pure public good, which means industry has trouble capturing the benefits from it. They don't do it. Development, which is the way of applying the current technologies in the current life cycles, that's where the innovations occur, the final step before commercialization. That's increased 94% in real dollar terms. That's very significant. But this transition phase between science and the attempts at innovation up here grew at half that rate. So, although this is aggregated data, it at least should bring into question, raise an alarm bell about our investment in new technology life cycles that are going to replace the old ones when Schumpeter's creative destruction process works its magic. So, although aggregated, I think this is the type of thing that should be put in front of more of our policymakers to try to convince them that the technology-based economy isn't as simple as many seem to think. And then one last point, the composition of R&D is as important as the amount. And if the point I made on the last diagram is valid, then this shows why. This is based on survey data in both North America and Europe, high-tech companies. Most product service innovations are incremental. They're derived from the current technology life cycle. They account for a dominant part of all product launches. 62% of revenue, 39% of profits. Major innovations. These are the ones that are based on the next generation or even more radical technologies. Only 14% of launches and 38% of revenues, but 61% of profits. And this is really a remarkable testimony to the importance of always being ready to move into the next life cycle. But if you look at the previous chart where industry is allocating most of its resources to development, then you have to have a concern about how we're going to be competing 5, 10 years from now. And in fact, I would say that although we've dominated every technology since World War II, nanoscience and the technologies based on it, that's going to be the first one where we're not the only player here. And if you look at the distribution of nano-related R&D around the world, we're one of 6 or 7 countries that are making significant investments. So that's why the growth paradigm needs to change. All right, now we get to the conceptual part of how we portray a high-tech industry. This is the conventional sort of neoclassical approach to looking at an industry, really whether or not across the top it relies on technology, but even if it does. Value added, again, in an accounting framework is the output of an industry, its contribution to GDP. And it consists of payments to workers, payments to capitalists, including stockholders. So since these are the people that vote, Congress is concerned about growing value added in the companies and industries in their district or state. So not being particularly sophisticated about economics, this is where they focus and they say to the policy analyst, show me how to make this value added grow. So the policy analyst has to work backward and look for the leverage points. In this model, unfortunately, you come to the technology and it's considered as a homogeneous entity. It's viewed as a black box, a total private good. In this model, science is a pure public good. It's really outside the marketplace. And it's assumed that somehow this science becomes available. Entrepreneurs, based on market price signals, will innovate and the value-added box will grow. Okay? So my argument is that this is a gross simplification of reality. So unfortunately, we need a somewhat more sophisticated view of industrial technology in order to more accurately define the government role. Blue, again, is a public good, red, a private good. Science-based, all blue, purely public. Some of these boxes you'll see are shaded red and blue. They are what economists call quasi-public goods. That means there's some government investment and some industry investment. By breaking this box apart into its, what I would call fundamental components, and these are not arbitrary, these are based on distinctly different investment incentives. And that is the key to understanding what industry will invest in and what it will not. Every technology has a platform, a generic base from which the applied R&D draws up here. This is really the black box from the previous diagram. But to get here, industry needs this platform. When I look at government funding, like NIH, they don't see this model. They see the previous slide, the black box model. So they fund science, then they wait for industry to come in, and develop drugs based on the advances in science. Unfortunately, by not developing the platform sufficiently, that greatly decreases the efficiency by which these proprietary technologies evolve. And there are cases like monoclonal antibodies, antisense technology, which is the first attempt to apply RNA interference concepts, 10, 20 years without any significant drug making it into the market. And it's because this platform was not fully developed. So billions of dollars, not to mention a lot of time, were wasted trying to innovate up here without having put sufficient investment here. And the reason is generic technologies have economies of scope. It's hard for companies to capture all the value. There's a longer time between research here and actually getting into the marketplace. So companies underinvest. The same thing's true for technical tools. You need them. You can't do research if you can't measure, if you don't have data. If you're looking at a market where you're selling a component or want to into a system technology, which most technologies are, you have to worry about interfaces so your product will fit. Otherwise, you can't sell it. And there are many, many infra technologies underlying every single high-tech industry. The semiconductor industry has over 700 standards. Imagine how low their productivity would be if those standards did not exist. And the technical basis for those standards are what I call infra technology. And these arrows show the direction of impact. And you can see that these are ubiquitous. You can't do scientific research, you can't do technology research, you can't control production for yield without data, without process control techniques. And even when you go to sell a product, it's a complex entity. The buyer is going to want some assurance that the product performs as specified, otherwise they don't buy it, the market doesn't evolve. So risk reduction depends on these infra technologies and the standards that are based on them. So, like it or not, this is reality. I mean, this is the way a high-tech industry functions. And everywhere you see blue, there is a potential role for government. Okay? Now, just as one example, in the black box model, these are using the same elements from the previous diagram. The black box model only sees the science base, the pure public good, and the innovations, the black boxes, the pure private goods. These three columns in the middle are ignored. But I went through all kinds of literature to come up with these examples of infra technologies, product and process generic technologies. Without these, do you really think you can get from here to here? The answer is absolutely no. If you don't fund these, then the efficiency, the productivity of R&D goes way down. And then one last point, you've heard this term valley of death. You know, again, this is going back to this Congress. Actually, if you go back to the 1980s, several congressional staffers on the Senate side realized that this valley of death, before it was called that, but labeled as such by the House Science and Technology Committee a decade later, they realized that we were underinvesting in these generic technologies. And so in 1988, when they changed MBS into NIST, one of the changes was to create the Advanced Technology Program, which was supposed to fund this transition phase of technology research. The reason is that the minute you look at a science space and you say, as a company, I think I can develop a technology based on that science, instantly you have two types of risk that enter into the picture. You've got technical risk, that you will never achieve the objectives necessary to penetrate the market. And you've got market risk because by the time you get to the market, which could take years here, demand may have shifted, competitors may have come into the market. And so this risk spike, which is, in my way as an economist, characterizing the valley of death, is a huge barrier to companies investing in radically new technologies. So just another way of defining the potential policy roles of government. Now, the last concept is the technology life cycle. We know we're seeing time compression because there are simply more actors in the world who can develop technology. So this puts, again, pressure on the efficiency of R&D. But getting the R&D done up to the initial innovation is only part of the problem. And this is where the Schumpeterian transition concept really comes home. The current technology has now up to point A, they've pretty much worked all the kinks out of the technology. They've optimized process to lower costs. So now they've really reached the maximum potential of this technology at point A. Performance relative to price is as high as it's probably going to get. But the installed base effect is working here. And they've sunk all the costs into moving up to this point. They don't want to change. So they're sitting there like the vacuum tube industry did when semiconductors was eating the floor out from under them. And they're crying for government help because they see down here this is potential technology that could drive them out of business. But the problem is the new technology suffers from imperfections in some of the attributes, maybe an incompletely developed technology platform, like the examples in biotech I gave. Markets are small, you don't have economies of scale, they're not large enough to warrant or rationalize investing in process technology. So you're at point B, even though this technology has a lot more potential, it's still performing below the existing technology. And that's why Schumpeter observed that new technologies could remain latent for a long period of time. So here's where another role for government comes in. By funding the generic technology, you can steepen the curve. So instead of taking the time to get to point C, you can get to the same level of performance earlier in time at point C prime. And now as you progress through this life cycle, as long as your domestic industry is on this dashed red line, rather than, say, the rest of the world, you are going to get the majority of the economic benefits from this technology over the whole life cycle. The problem is that in the real world, these are not standing still. These curves are shifting constantly. I mean, that's how markets get taken away by one country from another. So this is the strategy, but it's a constant one of management over the entire life cycle. And then same effect, well, not quite the same effect, can be had by more investment in the infra technology, tools, standards, and so on. You can actually lift the whole curve here because you're improving the efficiency of R&D, production, and marketing if you have the requisite set of infra technologies and the standards that are based on it. So now we get back to the multi-element technology model, and this is sort of the bottom line here. By flushing out the economics more accurately, you can target policies where they are most effective. You know, this is step 5 in that outline I showed you near the beginning. The black box model doesn't allow you to do this. It requires guesswork. And that's basically the way we're making policy these days. For example, 2 major policy tools are government funding, tax incentives. The R&D tax credit, the U.S. was the first one to implement such. But today, 27 years later, it's still temporary. It's been renewed 13 times. There's been periods of time when it elapsed. And I feel the problem is there's really no consensus on what market failure is being targeted. There's been very limited analysis of its impact and no analysis of alternative forms. For example, our credit is an incremental credit. Most of the countries that have imitated us use a flat tax rather than an incremental one. The IRS has said that incremental tax credit is one of the most difficult and expensive to manage. And it actually has disincentives built into it to the point where it does not reward increases in R&D after some point, because your base against which the increment is calculated grows. That was recognized, and so we switched to a sales base, but then that is discriminating against the more successful innovators who grow their company faster. Government funding. The neoclassical model says you fund basic science and not technology research. So we actually get away from that when there is a social objective like healthcare, national defense, environmental quality, whatever, space exploration. But when it comes to the social objective of economic growth, the black box model rears its ugly head, and you have this constant ideological pounding like we've seen in the case of ATP. In fact, ATP now finally was changed this past year into TIP, Technology Innovation Program, where instead of focusing on like tissue engineering, it's focusing on technology to build bridges, because a bridge is a public good, so that's what they're doing. So the problem down here really is we don't understand market failure, we can't agree on what they are because we have the wrong model. So, to wind up, there's a number of policy principles. Number one, the high-income economy must be the high-tech economy, although, as we've discussed, there have to be some redefinition of what is high-tech. Really important is that we must manage on a life cycle basis. We have to look at not only R&D, but how it's diffused and used over the whole life cycle. It's a public-private problem because of those blue areas in the multi-element model. Finally, we need to think more when we design policies about targeting the mobile assets. I've heard people say we shouldn't invest in R&D because the results diffuse overseas. Well, first of all, technology does not diffuse causelessly or instantly, but it does diffuse. So if you focus on innovation infrastructure, skilled labor, you will continue to produce new technical knowledge ahead of the competition. So finally, this point that I started off with about the lack of an institutionalized policy process is something we really have to solve here going forward. And so, finally, I'm going to allow myself the luxury of speculating, even though I've been preaching analysis. I really think the national goal should be to increase our R&D intensity to 5%. That would put us back in the leadership position in the world. I think the R&D tax credit needs to be restructured and enlarged to a 10% flat credit. A ballpark estimate that would double the tax expenditure currently being realized with the existing incremental credit. We need to take a portfolio management approach, just like a mutual fund manager, to how we allocate resources across different technologies. We are a large economy, we have to be diversified. We need to think of relative rates of return at any point in time and let that drive our funding. And then the multi-element model that we discussed has to drive policy analysis. And finally, R&D efficiency, as broadly defined, we're going to have to really get into this technology cluster game the rest of the world is. It's a much more R&D efficiency enhancing concept, and we're going to have to time our policies better over the life cycle. So, if we don't, that's the result. So, I know that was a lot. I thank you for your attention.
I think we're at the sooner here.
I would agree.
Greg, that was fascinating, and I think maybe that should be, I've got to go down and do some, new members of Congress do these sort of two-day retreats. I've got to go down and do one in Williamsburg, but it's not on this topic. We should all be required to hear your talk, because I think if every member of Congress and every new staffer came in and understood, particularly that slide about the neoclassical black box model, which is endemic in Washington. I was, I won't say the think tank, but there was another think tank that had me on a review panel for a paper they were doing on technology prizes, which was a nice idea. I like technology prizes as part of the toolbox, but it was all technology prizes for public goods, for social things. And I said, why don't you have a technology prize for competitiveness issues like a battery? This was before Senator McCain proposed his battery thing, and they all laughed and scoffed at me and said, that's industrial policy. The market will get us a good battery. The market got us a good battery. It's called the Japanese battery, because the Japanese government had a national battery policy. So that's how endemic it is. So we've got a little bit of time for questions or comments. If you can, let's go here first, and then in the back, if you could identify yourself and who you're with.
I'm Bill Canis with the Manufacturing Institute. Nice presentation. Could you talk a little bit more about this box you have on here, so central, called infra technology? What does that comprise?
Well,
Seems
those,
central to your argument that
yeah. The NIST labs basically produce info technologies. These are data. You can't do research in materials if you don't have materials property data. It's expensive, time-consuming to develop databases on characteristics of materials. It's used by everybody, including competitors, so it has a strong public good content. Similarly, you can't do research if you can't measure. How can you know what your experiment is producing? And it's not just enough to measure it, you have to have a method that's reproducible, so when you're done, you can convince others that what you have found is in fact reality. Other examples would be things like interface standards. Every technology is a system, and without these interfaces, you either have to engineer them yourself if you want to sell your component into this system, which of course is expensive. It doesn't mean other people will buy your interface. If you look at the way standards evolve, first there are no standards. People kludge things together. Then there may be what we call local standards. In other words, different standards for the same purpose across different groups of competitors. And then maybe halfway through the technology life cycle, they agree on one info technology as the basis for a standard. As I mentioned, I saw one estimate that there's over 700 standards in the semiconductor industry. We did a study last year of how much the semiconductor industry spent on measurement over a 10-year period, and it was I think, $51 billion, and that was in constant dollars. Very measurement intensive. So, but because it's a quasi-public good, it gets underinvested in. Industry will spend what they have to get the product into the market ahead of competition. That often leads to problems because the product doesn't perform or the interface doesn't work. We did another study of the info technology needs of biopharmaceuticals. Because as everyone knows, it's very costly and time-consuming to develop a new drug. And even after great expenditures, the drug can fail. Phase 2 has a 56% success rate. That's not very good. And when you consider it costs, on average, $1.2 billion to develop a new drug, you want to have the tools in place to maximize your R&D efficiency. And now we estimated that with a set of new advanced info technologies, biomarkers, bioinformatics, gene expression analysis, things like that, that the cost of the average new drug could be reduced anywhere from 30 to 57%. And the time to complete the R&D cycle and get FDA approval could be reduced by 20%. And I think we estimated that manufacturing costs for the typical drug could be reduced by 23%. These are huge numbers. And but because info technologies are not recognized, and the reason they're not is they're so diffuse. You've got, if you have 700 standards, how do you put that all together? They're affecting R&D, they're affecting production, they're affecting market transactions in the semiconductor industry. It's hard to get your hands around it and see its aggregate value unless you do a study like we did at NIST on measurement in the semiconductor industry. And so we underinvest in it. Again, we've gotten away with it as long as we were the only game on the world stage, and that's no longer the case. So now we look around the world, the U.S. used to write all the standards. Whatever the U.S. proposed, that was adopted. Boy, has that changed. Now it's a dogfight. And some large countries go around the world promoting their standards in order to enhance their exports.
In the back there.
Don Purcell, Catholic University School of Engineering. Greg, in the last few years, there have been a series of articles published about the decline of students studying engineering, science, and technology.
Mhm.
Can you share with us your comments on the demographics of the American workforce in the years ahead, and whether the United States will have a workforce that allows us to remain competitive from a technology point of view?
Well, there are others who focus on that more than I, but I certainly track, and in the book I have some discussion of that. We have a lower percentage of our students becoming scientists and engineers. And it's beginning to show up in published papers. The Europeans now publish more papers than we do. But what's really worrisome is that given that trend, and given the fact that our high-tech sector is only about 7% of GDP, and the United States only accounts for 4.5% of the world's population, we have to be concerned about the skills in our workforce. And of course, when you look at the offshoring from the less skilled industries, and this shows us where we're going. Even though, like computer and electronics, this value added has declined, that's because the lower skilled jobs have gone offshore. The remaining portion is higher skilled, higher paid, and is turning out higher value added, but it shrunk. Okay? And so we're going to have to expand the high-tech portion of our economy drastically going forward, and it's going to require more people going into science and engineering.
Yeah, just to give you a footnote, one of the reports I think is critical here is the DoD report last year. The report, the DoD estimated they lose half of their technology workforce in the next 5 years due to retirement. And so the big question is where are these people going to come from? And that's how they got to the education question. But it's a significant report that they published late last year. I think Rand did inform somebody, but it's a typical report of a huge macro issue that at the roots will be driven by the education system and whether or not we can respond. So, thanks very much.
Well, I would make one additional point there. You may have seen BLS projections, and they estimate supply versus demand, and it seems like a surprise in some areas where they estimate that the demand is going to be met by the current supply of high-tech workers. Well, of course, what they don't say is that's because that industry is shrinking. Okay? So, I mean, just that's another thing to keep in mind is you see some of these statistics and you really have to look behind them to see why they are getting you the message they carry.
Tim. Hi, Greg. Chris Mustang with IBM. Just want to make a comment and ask you a question. And one comment just from talking about these issues with the number of offices on the Hill. Yeah, I think if you talk to someone who's familiar with science and technology, you might get a familiarity with just the black box model. But you go outside of those communities, and I think the model is 3 boxes. Smart guy in a garage, production, value added, and it doesn't really get much beyond that, frankly. The question I had was, I was interested in your discussion of those sectors of the economy that were showing the growth in addition to the average of the GDP. And the focus on that, as you may know, IBM's been working in coalition with a number of companies and universities on service innovation and investment in research and skills for service innovation. And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the importance of that.
Well, actually, you were generating a question in my mind for you and IBM, but I'll try to answer yours first. Clearly, the data shows the growth is coming in high-tech services. Clearly, IBM is following that trend with larger and larger service revenues as opposed to manufacturing. So that brings a question up, which is, do we even need a manufacturing sector? And some economists argue we do not. In my book, I have a chapter where I talk about that, and I mean, I still see synergies. And if you don't have the physical proximity is kind of out of fashion because all people can talk about is the internet. And people can work collaboratively all over the world. Open innovation, one of the buzzwords in the business sector. However, if you're going to be, excuse me, the first mover, the innovator, most of the talking too much. Most of the knowledge that's generated in the first part of the life cycle is tacit, meaning people are carrying it around in their heads. So physical proximity, studies have shown that tacit knowledge is transferred primarily from person to person. Only later on in the cycle, when it becomes more codified, can you transfer over the internet or by some other means. And so it is misleading to think that you can just forget about your manufacturing when that technology still drives service industries. It will result in delays within the domestic economy. At least, I mean, that's my opinion, and I have to say it's an assertion because it's something that's really hasn't been studied to the best of my knowledge, is this transfer of knowledge. All technology is clearly not embodied in the boxes that manufacturers ship to service companies. You have to integrate those boxes into systems. And systems productivity is something that we really don't hear much about. Now, companies have to worry about it because you can have the most elegant technology boxes in the world, but you can't put them together in a functioning system. And again, there's a public good content to this because there are certain concepts associated with integration of a manufacturing or a service system that are fairly common across companies and involves a lot of standards. We did a study a couple years ago of the Internet Protocol because we've been using the same protocol for 20 years, and as the Internet has exploded across the world, it turns out that the number of addresses capacity is being used up. And so, being inventive, people have devised ways of expanding addresses by hiding them behind walls that interface directly with the internet. But that has some security issues, it has some efficiency issues. So anyway, for 10 years there's been this international task force trying to design the next internet protocol, which is so much address space that it could, as far as that's concerned, probably be adequate for the next 30, 50 years. But the problem is the complexity. This standard has all kinds of interfaces between physical technology, the black boxes, the systems. It has all these requirements laid on it for security and for different types of access. So between private networks and public network. So it is a horrendously complex job, and I can't imagine an economy benefiting from something like that if you're not active in both the manufacturing side and the understanding it, and the services that ride on top of this system of black boxes. So, or at least you're going to be late to the game at best.
Yes, sir.
Mark Ottinger, Southeastern University's Research Association. We're right around the corner from here. A question about same slide, actually, the top 10 states by share of R&D performance. What are you actually suggesting with this slide? Is that these states are just better at state investment, tax structure for science and technology, or any other conclusions from that slide?
I think that's basically it. The states that have, and this is R&D performance, so it's their own investment plus funds coming from outside. So why do the funds come from outside? Well, it's the same set of factors that I was alluding to at the national level. It's an innovation infrastructure. The states are the only game in town in these technology clusters. They're setting them up themselves. They are looking for outside money, and they're getting it because industry sees the efficiency opportunities in participating in these clusters. Where you have universities, you're surrounded by large and small companies. Venture capital moves in. You have the ability to transfer the knowledge that's tacit in the early phases of a new technology's development. the professors take a leave of absence, they go work with a company, but even if they don't do that, they're available to consult. So the answer is yes, the states are taking the initiative, being much more aggressive and in discarding the neoclassical model and understanding the public good content of these elements that we discuss of typical technology. And the federal government is basically out to lunch here. We need to get in the game. We can provide cross-fertilization. We can do research to help better design, manage clusters. Those are, I mean, the tax incentives enter into the picture. Many states add a R&D tax credit on top of the national limit. So it's a combination of factors, but I think this cluster concept is a wave of the future in terms of attracting R&D capital.
Just on that point, if you're interested, we do a report called the State New Economy Index with the Kauffman Foundation, and I'd be happy to give you a copy today if you're interested, or it's also on our website. It goes into an enormous amount of detail, 27 different indicators, one of them R&D intensity. And we're going to be releasing that again in November of 2008 will be the new updated version with the latest R&D data in there. And so you get a much more, it basically says what Greg says, but it's a much more detailed picture of all of that. Yes, sir.
Dennis Gravel with the U.S. International Trade Commission. I have 3 quick questions. Back on your slide on page 5, your first one, where you show profit differentials for major and minor innovations.
Mm-hmm.
You say that 61% of profits come from major innovations. Do you know how much of that is generated by extreme users or advanced users, like say NASA or DoD? And then a follow-up question there would be on your macro indicators for 2000 going forward. If you stripped out defense spending and national security type spending, that would be over and above what would be normal national security, what would those trends look like? And the third quick question would be, do you see an erosion of U.S. R&D in the semiconductor manufacturing equipment industry as the extreme users seem to be migrating to Asia? That relates to the first question. Sorry.
I don't know the answer to your first question. Those surveys were very broad across a lot of different industries. So these were companies that developed technologies where the science base and probably some of the generic technology came from outside the company. I mean, that's a normal process. It's done efficiently, randomly. Now we're finally across the world beginning to look at how that should happen in a more efficient framework. So sort of one of my major points. So, and your second question?
If you stripped out defense or national security, what would your trend line?
Well, it would make the U.S. look worse. AAAS, I think, has done this. They pulled the S&T portion of the budget apart. The United States, the UK have larger portions of their R&D targeted at defense. Now, clearly, DoD has an S&T budget, and it's very broad, and over the post-war period, it has, particularly through DARPA, developed a lot of the generic technologies which drive the economy today. And Bill, way in the back, has done some work on that. So the S&T budget is important in contributing to the technology base of the country. However, I have a chart, which I didn't put in this presentation, that shows that the S&T portion of the DoD budget in constant dollars has been flat for 15 years. And see, again, this is why it's so important to look inside the numbers at a more microeconomic level, because if you looked at the total DoD R&D curve, goes up quite strongly, but all the growth is in applied R&D focused on weapon system development.
Just on that point, we're going to be doing an event, I believe it's the second Tuesday of October. If you're interested, it'll be on our website and we'll send you a notice There's a new report that Erica Fuchs, who's a scholar at Carnegie Mellon, has issued on DARPA. In fact, she'll be releasing it at our event, and it's a very in-depth look at how DARPA has changed in the last decade and what the implications of that are. Is DARPA still an effective driver of innovation? So, yes, sir, here, and then here, and then here. So,
Derek Hill, National Science Foundation. Question on your R&D intensity. If you went from, let's say, 3% of GDP to 5% in the U.S., couldn't you argue that since the U.S. economy is so huge already that there's kind of a scale effect with R&D, that we're already at such a relatively huge level of spending versus other countries that, you know, I'm not sure. Some people say we don't have the capacity to go up to 5%, that it'd be difficult to do that. The second question is, I guess, if we're now in a global economy and corporations are global, if we ramped up our R&D spending, but let's say IBM did R&D in the US, but then basically transferred that technology to China where the markets are growing much faster, would we still get a lot of benefit from that?
Well, if you want, first of all, if you want the value added in your country, you're going to have to support the R&D here. As far as scale effects, as I mentioned, there's $1 trillion being spent on R&D right now, and it's growing rapidly. So I don't see any scale problems. It would not be easy. As I threw that up there just as a thought-provoking item, it would mean another $300 billion allocated to R&D. Of course, these days, what's $100 billion? So just declare a national disaster.
It's this morning.
Yeah, there you are. So, but it's, keep in mind that the income growth, we are the high income economy because we've been the high tech economy. The BLS data show that clearly. We've got maybe 40 states that are not by some rough metric high tech. So we either forget about them or we grow the high tech portion of the economy, diffuse it geographically, and maintain our status as a high income economy. Otherwise, over time, these other countries who have the objective of raising the R&D intensity will eventually pass us. The international comparison I showed you, we're down to 8th place. I haven't seen any economic analysis that shows diminishing returns to R&D, by the way. But it's true, this would raise our share if we did it overnight. And obviously that's not going to happen. These other countries who are trying to raise their intensity are having a frustrating time doing so because of the competing demands on budgets. Europe has had this goal now for 10 years to get to 3%, and they're not making a lot of progress. But they are pushing and shoving as best they can. So I'm not saying 5% is a magic number, but I'm pretty sure we need to be higher than we are by some significant amount.
Laurent Boschko, European Commission. On your last slide, you said that the federal R&D should be better balanced between IT, biotechnologies, and nanotechnologies. Could you elaborate on this?
Well, when we get a national passion, we go for it. And you know, we decided 30 years ago we were going to greatly improve healthcare. So we put an enormous amount of resources into healthcare research. Nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, we have, in my opinion at least, neglected some of the other areas of technology. We have our funding in the IT areas is sort of leveled off. Materials, many of the areas that are important, and that's been partially recognized, at least that resulted in the American Competitiveness Initiative, which hasn't been funded, but that was the motivation behind that act, was to redress the imbalance by increasing investment in the physical sciences generally. So it's just like a mutual fund. No matter how good we are now in biotechnology, the rest of the world sees it, and they are investing increasingly large amounts of resources in biopharmaceutical research to catch up to us. So if you want to put all or most of our eggs in that one basket, you're taking a big risk. It's just like a mutual fund manager. No matter how good one of his investment companies is performing, she knows you need to have diversity to allow for the unknown. So.
I have a question for both the speaker and the moderator, if I may. Greg, Steve Pearson of the American Statistical Association, and I want to thank you for the wonderful work that you were doing. Implicit in your imperatives is more federal funding for a number of different areas. And as you just mentioned, it's been hard to fund the ACI, and that was even before the bailout. I can only see it being harder in the subsequent years. So have you explored other funding mechanisms? And a lot of ideas have been out there. I heard of one of, instead of the transportation infrastructure that we fund, we mean trust fund to fund kind of our interstates and highways, but have kind of a high-tech infrastructure fund or any such options like that? Have you looked at anything else besides federal spending? And I know you mentioned R&D tax credit.
You mean sources of funding? I don't know. I can't imagine where else the funds are going to come from. You have to have a balance. What the balance is open to debate between public and private funding. That's what some of those earlier trends meant to raise to you, was this issue of the divergence that's growing between public and private investment. But it's still got to come from both of those sources. Now, the precise mechanism, again, depends on what the policy objective is. You can use tax incentives for certain types of market failures. You use direct funding for other types. And the policy process needs to know the difference, because they're not substitutes. Okay? Conservatives think that tax incentives are great because they're market neutral. They're not. The government is making a decision. Unfortunately, tax incentives are used primarily by companies to do more of what they're already doing. So it enhances investment in the current life cycle, but it's not going to address the radically new technologies. They're just not on the radar screen of the typical company R&D strategy.
Hi, I'm Bob Bergen with Astra, and Greg, I actually have 30 questions to ask you, so if I might, I'd like to focus on a few things which have been brought up by the audience. One, are there good studies that would actually prove a return on investment? Why can't we convince policymakers that the investment somehow pays off overall? What studies would you cite?
Well, in the beginning, I had that list up. Well, there are summaries of those studies. I have some of them. They're referenced in my book, chapter 3. There have been economists that have looked across these studies and published a paper, which I also cite. There's been several of those over the past couple of decades, reviewing all the other economic research. And that's how you come to that sort of average differential between investment in capital and R&D of 4 to 1. Now, NIST, by the way, is the only one that's done studies of infra technologies. We've done about 20 of those studies, the rates of return. Economists, by and large, have looked at the rate of return to R&D as a whole, which is unfortunate, but the data did not permit them to do anything else, to get inside the black box. There have been some studies that tried to separate basic research from technology research. That's been about it. Unfortunately, partly because I've nagged NSF along with some others, 10 years, they're finally going to change their data collection strategy to capture the investment in these radically new technologies. That will be a great benefit to analyzing the leverage points. So that will be a good thing. It's going to take a couple of years to fully implement.
And to follow up on that, do you have adequate statistical
underpinning for your analysis? Do you feel the government is generating timely and salient indicators for you to make policy recommendations?
Well, I would say that NSF provides excellent indicators, mainly on R&D. That's the input side. And as I said, they're constrained by the current classification system, basic, applied, development, but they have a wealth of information. Where the problem arises more is measures of invention, and then measures of innovation, and then indicators of the growth in technology and its impacts, the rates of return as this life cycle matures. We have a much weaker understanding of those latter phases.
Thank you.
Just to respond to your point, I think that statistics are useful, but I think at the end of the day, people don't do this or they do it or they don't do it, not based on rationality. Rationality is sort of a secondary function. It's based more on worldview. If you read Bob Rubin's book, for example, arguably a brilliant man, very intelligent, Bob Rubin basically says that technology had no effect, played no role in the 1980s growth miracle. It had all to do with financial capital. And that's because he's channeling a worldview of what we call Rubinomics, channeling his own worldview, but there are lots of people in Washington who have bought into that worldview. It's a version of neoclassical economics that says that capital drives growth. And touting our own horn, if there's a new report that we just issued last week with David Adresh, where we go through and look in detail at these four competing models, the conservative neoclassical, liberal neoclassical, neo-Keynesian, and what we would call innovation economics, which Greg is a leading theoretician and researcher in. But I think it's getting people to reframe the paradigm to understand that it's not capital that drives growth, it's innovation, and that it's not markets acting alone on price signals that get us to this promised land, but that you need these public-private partnerships. Unless you get that framework right, you can give people all the studies in the world and they'll dismiss them, or they'll say, oh yeah, we know R&D is important, let's expand basic research. And they just simply don't understand it. It's hard to get people to understand it unless you reframe it, I think.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, that gets us into, we've talked a lot about the analysis and the policy prescription for it. I wondered, as, 2 seasons hand on these issues, if you could talk a little bit about how we change the politics of this issue. How do we raise the profile and priority of these issues to get something like America Competes funded?
You're not. He's not allowed to speak. I'll say what he can't say.
Yeah. See, I could go back to NIST tonight and retire, but I prefer to pick today. So.
Well, again, without sounding too, ethereal and long-term, I really, really think that if everybody in this community got together and said, we're going to focus at least 20% of our time, 10% of our time for the next 3 years on everybody saying innovation economics is the frame, and just start talking about that and educate policymakers in very simple ways, like it's not capital that drives growth, it's innovation. I think that would help, because I think ultimately a lot of the folks there simply don't understand how this process works. The other thing is, I think we need to be bold. I mean, I think, I remember a few years ago when I proposed a $10 billion increase in federal R&D, because at $2 billion a year ramp up, because that would get us back to the federal R&D to GDP ratio we had like 10 years before that. And people laughed at me. That's way too bold. It's way too big. I think we've got to be bigger and bolder. And the other thing I think is we've got to really challenge these people who simply don't accept or embrace the kind of view we do. I mean, whether that's on the left or the right. I mean, there are vast swaths of the left that have absolutely no growth strategy. It's simply a redistribution strategy. And there are vast swaths of the right that have a growth strategy that's based upon doing nothing. And I think that we've got to really just, let me add one other thing. I think it's a mistake to focus solely on science. I think that's too narrow. It ends up being seen as special pleading. I think that the argument and the debate has got to be, science is a key component of it, but it's got to be broader than that. And to touted one little thing we did there, is the National Innovation Foundation idea. At least from talking to Hill staff, one of the things that Senate Commerce folks said to us was, we like this idea because we could see it related to jobs in our own community, because it's related to technology clusters and things like that. So I think we got to broaden the entire debate, that it's not just about science funding, it's about an entire array of components that Greg laid out, and saying that that's got to be the centerpiece of economic policy. That's my last point on that. I'm sorry for going on so long. The problem with this debate, I think, is that it's seen science. There's a science policy ghetto. You know, let's just give those science policy folks a few crumbs, and then maybe they'll go away and be quiet. Innovation policy has to be economic policy. It is economic policy, and I think that's the point that hasn't been made to people. You can't have an economic policy without innovation policy comprising 75% of it, if you want an effective one. And by innovation policy, I mean what Greg was talking about, not just bumping up NSF, which we need to bump up NSF. I'm not saying we don't. But we got to do a lot more than that, too. Yeah.
Monica McGuire, National Association of Manufacturers. I just have to jump in here. I apologize that I have been blackmailed throughout this whole meeting. But the business community is trying to get a letter done today, signed by companies and associations on all the tax extenders, including the R&D credits. So my BlackBerry is just going off completely as I'm reaching out to companies and associations. But it's a good question that you asked. One observation I've had, having worked the R&D credit issue from a lobbyist point of view, advocacy point of view, is that it's a mother and apple pie issue. And look, it actually is not. I don't think it's been renewed 13 times. We're trying to get renewed the 13th time. It's expired 13 times. This will be the 13th time we can get it renewed. I'm not sure that we'll get it renewed, but if companies could give more anecdotal information about the impact of the R&D credit to members of Congress and their congressional staffers, I think, and I realize that some of that is proprietary information, but if maybe you can look at give them historical information. I just got an email from a Hill staffer of a tax writing committee member saying, Monica, my boss wants today to know, well, how much investment's going to be lost because we don't renew the credit? How many jobs are going to be lost? And those are hard questions because I know that companies have R&D budgets that usually span typically 5 years or so, and so they're not going to stop an R&D project midstream. That would be imprudent, but they might cut something else, in their business spending plan. And so that's a hard message to compel members of Congress because they just think, well, companies are going to do the R&D, which they do have to do some R&D to remain globally competitive. But of course, we want them to do more R&D because that's how our economy grows. So. That's my 2 cents. Companies, if you have anecdotal information, that is so helpful when you relay that to members of Congress and their staffs. And then the second comment on this, we've kind of been working on focusing on R&D employees. I believe that there's, from NSF data, there are, I believe, more than 1 million R&D employees. That was kind of eye-opening to me here in the United States. And the R&D credit is really about jobs, especially the credit dollars go to R&D wages here in the United States. And so again, companies, if you could stress the importance of your R&D employees, get your R&D employees activated, and we did that for the first time this year. I don't know if we'll be successful. The credit remains expired. Congress is going to probably go out after this week, but we're doing a last full court press. That's sorry for my soapbox. You hit a nerve in.
Monica, we actually do know how much if you get rid of the R&D credit, we do know, and the report we did last year shows that if you look at the empirical studies, it's between the value of the tax loss and double that. So it's between what's the tax loss? 3 billion, 6 billion.
The revenue estimate for 1 year extension is 8 billion, 9
billion. 8 billion. Yeah. So the loss is between 8 to 16 billion in U.S. corporate R&D annually. Now that's not going to occur right away, but that will be at least if you look at the econometric models, that's the amount of R&D that will be reduced.
But they would have to do a lot more R&D than that just to get a $9 billion. Do you understand?
No, I'm saying if you look at the empirical studies, though,
right.
It's between the amount of induced R&D from the credit is between $9 and $18 billion.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay, I'll definitely send that to this.
I think on that note, we should we need to adjourn. I promised we'd be out at 10:30. But I'd also encourage you to take a look at this. Greg talked about infra technology, or generic technologies, and IT is clearly a generic technology, in fact, maybe one of the most important. We have an event on Thursday, which I encourage you all to attend, or pass this information along to colleagues if you think are interested, where we're releasing our reports usually are quite small, but this one is quite big. It's about a 260-page report that we've been working on for about a year, looking at a very in-depth way at how IT is transforming everything that we care about, from healthcare to national security to environmental protection, energy, education, transportation. There's a whole series of analysis in this report. We're releasing it with Craig Mundy, who's one of the number 2 guys at Microsoft, on Thursday, so hopefully we'll all see you there. So on that note, this was a really great presentation, Greg, and so please join me in thanking Greg Tassey.